Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Campfire Chat organized by C2G on large-scale carbon dioxide reduction and the Arctic. We have four amazing people to share their experience and their points of view with us today. I will ask them in a moment to introduce themselves. And after that, we will have a discussion around this virtual campfire. We're not going to make long speeches. The idea is to have a discussion initially between the speakers, the invited speakers, and then after that, we will open for question and answers. So please prepare your questions, those who are participating in this event. To start, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, who organized this event. I've been doing this, I've been in this position since 2016. Before that, I worked for many years in the United Nations, including my last position was UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. Before that, I worked in various UN and also civil society organizations, including in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where incidentally I had the opportunity to work together with one of our speakers, Halldór, but also worked in the UN Environment Program, WWF, and many other organizations over the years. Basically, I've been working on climate change and sustainable development for the last 4 decades, and I have 3 grandchildren, and I feel I owe them to continue to contribute to the unfinished business of reducing the climate crisis. So that's why I'm in this business. Thank you. So with that, Shawna, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Good morning, and Sarita Chamaka. My name is Shawna Larson. I'm Sukbi on my mom's side from the village of Palawick, also known as Port Graham in Alaska, and I'm Atna Athabaskan on my dad's side from the village of Naidiniana, also known as Chicaloon Village. I serve as the Deputy Director at the organization Native Movement, and I also serve on our Traditional Tribal Council in Chicaloon Village. And to everybody watching, happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you very much, Shawna. And next, Halldór, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Halldór. I'm son of Thorgeirsson, and I speak to you from Iceland. I am a scientist by training, started by doing research on carbon cycling through ecosystems, which led to getting involved with international climate issues, first for the government of Iceland, and then for 14 years with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Secretariat, Climate Change Secretariat, and which ended with the agreement of or conclusion of the Paris Agreement, which I was quite involved with. I've now returned after retirement to my native country, where I'm working on building the national response through National Climate Council that is now entering into its 3rd year. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór. Pam, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Pam Pearson. I'm honored for occasionally being mistaken for a scientist, but my background actually is diplomacy. I spent 20 years as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State. I worked on issues ranging from nuclear nonproliferation to health, environment, and of course climate, including the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. Served in a variety of countries, including Ecuador, Sweden, and Norway, all of which are Cryosphere nations. For the past 10 years, I've served as the director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, which focuses on the impact both on and increasingly from cryosphere regions, which is simply anywhere with ice and snow. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And last but not least, Brad, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, good day, everybody. My name is Brad Ack, and like Janos, I have a sort of a long career in environmental issues, working on the biodiversity crisis and sustainable development, really for about the last 35 years, with a number of different organizations. I recently left my position as Senior Vice President for Oceans at World Wildlife Fund a year ago to create the Ocean Climate Alliance, which is really dedicated to a new agenda on oceans and climate. and even more recently have joined forces to become the executive director of Ocean Visions, which is a consortium of significant research and academic institutions dedicated to working with the private sector to bring ocean solutions into practice. Happy to be with you.
Thank you, Brad. So you can see and hear that we have a really excellent group of guests with us, and I look forward to discussing with them about these issues. Before getting into that, let me just say a few words about C2G and about this event that we're organizing. So we are basically a small foundation-funded initiative, and we have a very simple mission to catalyze the creation of effective governance of climate-altering approaches such as carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We like to be, and we think we are impartial about the use or not of these approaches. The idea behind our work is if societies decide to think about going in these directions, then one needs to think about how to govern them best. One part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations between different stakeholders to learn and better understand what these issues are all about. And the whole C2GLearn process, of which this Campfire Chat is part of that process, where we brought together 50 different experts like yourselves, our guests, and others in various webinars and Campfire Chats. These are a very important part of the overall governance as we look at it. Now, the purpose of our Campfire Chats is not to have a complicated topic and try to come to conclusion. The idea is to show that there is a diversity of views. People have different perspectives because they come from different situations, different contexts. And so the idea is to bring the views together, not to convince the other that one is right and the other is wrong, not to come to a unified conclusion. Of course, given the few participants in terms of speakers that we can have in such a Campfire Chat, it's very difficult to get the full diversity of views represented because there are usually more than 3, 4, or 5 major diverse views. So this is a constant challenge for us, and we cannot represent the full diversity at every webinar and every Campfire Chat. But on the whole, as I mentioned, we have some 50 experts from different parts of the world engaged in this process. I think on the whole, we have managed quite well. Now, of course, we will have views, and it must be also understood that the views expressed are those of the guest and not of C2G. Now, just a few words about the topic of this exercise, the Arctic. The Arctic is a little bit like the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? Except that it's not canary, but a polar bear, and maybe the coal mine is more like the Arctic ice. So this is really a very challenging situation, and I must say I've had personally the opportunity to go up to the Arctic twice in one of my previous jobs, and to go pretty far toward the pole on the ice itself. And again, talking about my grandchildren, it's important that they at least have that possibility to walk on the ice as opposed to go there just by boat at some point in the future. But the Arctic is having more than twice, almost 2.5 times the average of global warming. And that's really serious. And those are just the averages. And then there are exceptional periods. And the ice is disappearing. And the disappearing ice provides a dual challenge. One is on the Arctic ecosystems themselves. But a very significant other impact is the lowering of the albedo, which means that as the ice disappears, even more warming occurs. And then, of course, part of the problem that we're facing in the Arctic is that while we look at these as problems, some look at this as economic opportunities. So there are different forces in the Arctic. So what to do about the ice and what to do about the warming itself, these are the kind of issues that we will be looking at. And then there is large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We've had a whole webinar and other Campfire Chats about this topic, but to what extent can carbon dioxide removal help, directly or indirectly? in or outside the Arctic? These are some of the questions that we will be addressing. Now, we're not going to be able to neither address nor resolve all the issues here. That's not the purpose of this event. But we do hope to bring up the key governance challenges, how existing frameworks are addressing these issues, and what different stakeholders are doing in this process. So with that, I will stop here and let's get to the actual session. So as I mentioned earlier, I will start off the discussion by asking each of our guest speakers a question to get the discussion going. Then we'll have a discussion with the speakers around the fire, and then we'll open for question and answer session. So in the meantime, dear participants, dear attendees, please record your questions in the Q&A button of the Zoom application. Please note that there's also a like button. So if you like somebody else's question, you can press the like, click on the like, and then that will get a higher priority. So the more likes one question, a particular question has, the more likely we will be able to actually address that question. There's also the chat box. If you feel like chatting between other participants and so on, please use that, but don't put the questions in the chat box because it's better to structure it through the Q&A session. So with that, let's start. And I would like to start the discussion by asking the first question to Pam. And if you could help us to share your perspectives on what do you think is the role of the Arctic in the global climate and how the global climate change affects the Arctic. And also, if you have any thoughts on how you see the role of carbon dioxide removal in all this. Yeah. So please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And, as you referred to, the Arctic has traditionally been called the canary in the coal mine, but it's moved from this indicator of just how fast climate change is occurring to what we're talking about and what scientists talk about as an actual driver of climate change and driver of climate change impacts. And it actually might not be too much of an exaggeration to say that the struggle to prevent dangerous climate change is going to be decided by cryosphere regions. Behind me, you actually see a map of Antarctica, and I don't want to forget that, even though our focus is on the Arctic. But if we lose the cryosphere, and in particular, you may hear me talk a bit also about Antarctica, we lose the climate. The geopolitics of the Arctic are definitely growing increasingly complicated, but as Janos said, one really negative trend is that several of the major actors in the region and virtually all commercial interests do see it in terms just of new resources and business opportunities. But in reality, the kind of Arctic that would allow such opportunities to exist would also exist on a planet that literally would make some portions of those same countries, and particularly, I would say, the United States and China, literally unlivable because of sea level rise and other impacts. And again, we can talk more about the science behind that reality. In terms of CDR, the Arctic and other cryosphere have a number of things to say to us. So I thought I'd just raise three broad themes at this point. First, one often hears the Arctic identified as a place where BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, could be widely deployed. One of the issues with that is that the amount of land used, according to most models, if it's in the Arctic, is huge and would endanger these highly sensitive ecosystems. So we run a risk of destroying the very ecosystems that we're really trying to save. Second, this technology does not yet exist at scale. And that's led to a great reliance, including by some climate science, like in the special report on 1.5 degrees, on something that, really in practice does not exist, whereas mitigation is something we can do. It's just really hard. So if CDR is deployed, particularly to save a place like the Arctic, it needs to be in a manner that is a minor complement to reductions in CO2, because we know reductions can work. We're not sure about CDR, so there's a big uncertainty there. But then third, and perhaps most important, most models using CDR, including by the IPCC, assume overshoot, temperature overshoot. But for the cryosphere, overshoot is not an option. And I'll repeat that. If you can just remember one thing from this session and my words, because of cryosphere and how it works, temperature overshoot, allowing temperatures temporarily to go above 1.5 degrees, let alone 2 degrees C, because you're thinking of relying on massive CDR late in the century to bring it down again, simply is not an option. And more science is pointing in that direction, both for Greenland and for Antarctica. So I look forward to developing these ideas further in our future discussions. But CDR can have a role to play, but it needs to be early and it needs to be minor.
Thank you, Pam. And two really key issues I take away from what you said. The first is that the cryosphere as a driver, very important. And the second one is this business of the overshoot, that for the cryosphere, the overshoot is a real issue, much bigger than perhaps in some other situations. Well, we'll come back to this perhaps. Yeah. Okay, so let's go maybe to Brad now. And Brad, if you could say a few words from your perspective of what you see as the key tools that we have at our disposal to save the Arctic and therefore to save the world, if you follow what Pam just said. And if you could share with us a few thoughts there.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Pam, for your comments. You know, I am firmly of the belief that we are in the midst of the climate crisis now, and it is more severe than what has been predicted. And we are seeing the evidence around us every day about that. The Arctic is clearly one of the leading examples on the planet of rapidly occurring climate change. And in fact, the danger of shifting completely from a frozen state to a non-frozen state, you know, essentially a tipping point from which there might be no return and which would be extremely dangerous for the whole planet, because the Arctic really serves as essentially an air conditioner and weather regulator and ocean current regulator for the entire planet, many other functions. So my sense is that we do not have a precautionary approach to climate right now. This concept of a 1.5 goal, I think, is dangerous because we are already at dangerous levels of climate change. And were we to stop emitting tomorrow, those are locked in for many, many years to come. And so what we're seeing in the Arctic now will continue and worsen. And our level of science and ability to predict that is very nascent. But it's very hard to argue with the fact that it will continue and that we have this baked in. So a 1.5 degree target's not precautionary. What would be precautionary is to work on reversing this problem, halting it and reversing it. And I'll have to disagree with Pam. I think that CDR is going to have a major role to play in that, because we have put about 2,000 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. We're putting an increment in every year, but the driver of most of the damage is already there. So it's like a giant Superfund site in the atmosphere. We've cleaned up pollution in our bays, in our rivers, in our lands for years. The environmental community was born around pollution cleanup, but for some reason, we've been unable to wrap our mind around cleaning up the pollution that's in the atmosphere. So we have to do that, and we have to, I do agree with Pam that the science and the technology is nascent. We need a massive upscaling of investment in building the technologies for CDR, and we need to find the ones that are the most benign, the least harmful. So I'm clearly on the same side of being very careful about unintended consequences. But even that is unlikely to be fast enough to arrest, to be precautionary about the possibility of dangerous change. And therefore, we also need to be thinking about the science and technology to forestall some of these changes. Can we slow down the loss of ice? Can we slow down the melting of permafrost? Because our lives literally depend on it. And that science is wholly underinvested and underdeveloped. And we need to massively scale that, because CDR will not be a site-specific solution for the Arctic. It works on a global scale, and it will take years to bring temperature back down, years and years. So we also need to buy ourselves some time and avoid dangerous tipping points. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. So we're in serious crisis, and we need to find ways to reverse what's been happening. CDR, in your view, has an important role to play, a very important role, if I can use your words. And we need to look at the other areas where science is still quite weak, to find out what else we can do to slow down the disappearance of the ice and the melting of the permafrost and the related issues. Okay, wow. Lot to do here. All right. Shawna, can I come to you now? And we, of course, have lots of people living in the Arctic. They all tend to live in the in a whole big region that covers many countries. And maybe it's a good time to ask you, from your perspective, of how people of the Arctic consider these issues that we're talking about. What are their views, and what do they think should be done? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I would first start out by saying, in particular, as Indigenous people, we're not a monolith, and so I can't speak for everybody, but I would say that in particular for my tribe, we do have a lot of concerns about some of the proposed technologies. It's a little bit interesting to understand in particular that all of a sudden the global community is very interested in our lands and the climate crisis that's happening on our lands. But still, we find that most of the time the Indigenous people are forgotten. And so from our traditional perspective, from my tribal perspective, obviously, we would like to see the people and the tribes respected and considered in these decision-making processes, as well as having their sovereignty and self-determination recognized. And so, we do talk about the canary in the coal mine, and I have also heard that phrasing used under the Stockholm Convention or the POPs Treaty, talking about, how when DDT is sprayed in South Africa, it really only takes about 10 days to reach the Arctic, and now we're finding it in women's breast milk. And so thinking about the canary in the coal mine and then putting all the emphasis on the ice and the polar bears always feels a little bit dismissive to the Indigenous people. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's important, and we'll come back to some of these questions, I presume, in the discussion. Now, Halldór, from your experience and from your perspective, what do you see as, what are the key governance frameworks that actually exist in the Arctic that can help, or which are hindering progress in this area? How can they address these issues, and what are some of the current and upcoming challenges as you see it?
Yes, thank you very much, Janos. And maybe it's good for the listeners to maybe be honest in terms of my frame of mind. I'm actually dead scared about what's going on. And I think we have to be honest about that. I also think it's important that we come at this with a sense of humility. And that is living, for example, in Iceland. This island is we're really quite close to nature, and some of the discussions I find underestimating or overestimating our ability to intervene surgically on some of those processes. And for that reason, my sense is that we really need to focus on Plan A, which is to fundamentally transform the economy. And I'm not saying this to take the discussion away from CDR. I just wanted to put CDR in its proper context. And the discussions about our ability to transfer the economy have not been very well informed. They've been very much based on looking through the rear view mirror and basically vested interests trying to convince us that the way the energy system is structured has to be like that forever. And therefore, I really wanted to kind of underline the potential and the importance of early action and the benefits of early action and the benefits of the transition away from old energy systems. And Iceland is entirely runs entirely on renewables in terms of power, and we are actively working on doing the same in terms of fuel. And so that just has to be kind of the alpha and omega of what we're framing what we're doing. Having said that, I think it's also important to speak up and explain the fundamental thinking behind the Paris Agreement, because it's not very well understood. And I agree with Brad that focusing too much on the indicators in terms of temperature can be confusing. What I think is the most important signal is that we need urgently to achieve carbon neutrality. And I think it's important to explain that to people and so that they can wrap their head around this. And you can call it net zero as well. And so globally, at the global level, you're basically talking that global emissions can be no more than global removals at any one time. And there is no question in my mind that removals will have to be a big part of at least the bridging aspects of the solution. And therefore, we really need to invest in research on this. And I have some good news from Iceland in that regard. There is effort here that is referred to as carb fix that allows you to, if you can, capture CO2 at sufficient concentrations. You can actually pump it down into active basalt layers, and it actually becomes petrified. It actually becomes part of the geology. It's not capped under layers like you would do in traditional carbon dioxide CCS technologies. And this, but it also illustrates the importance of actually getting to do some of these things. Is that technology now is now operational for a geothermal power plant, but it took them 12 years to get to that point. So you don't come up with these solutions overnight, and this is why it's so important to basically start opening up all of those things. And so my kind of main signal is that we do not have the luxury of taking solutions off the table prematurely. And that's a huge responsibility in my view. So that's not suggesting, I'm not saying this to suggest that anything goes. That's not what I'm talking about. But we have to have very strong evidence about adverse effects before we say that this is not part of the solution. And therefore, I think it's so important to start getting to understand more of these different solutions in terms of their scalability, in terms of their effects. And therefore, I have advocated for research in these areas, not basically taking things too quickly off the table. I also wanted to underline that's my final point here, Janos, is that the Paris Agreement is basically a risk management approach, based on a risk management approach, where we are managing risks. There's no certainty of outcomes. For that reason, I actually see the Arctic and information about the Arctic extremely important for the globe. And you asked about governance in the Arctic. My first question here is to what extent are the Arctic states, the member states to the Arctic Council? There's a council that brings together the Arctic states. These states have huge historic responsibility for the emissions already in the atmosphere. And for them, so the first question to them, it's not what are you doing in the Arctic, what are you doing globally? And that's why I think we have to kind of face the realities that many of them around the Arctic table actually are really struggling with their own climate policies. And that's a serious worry. Having said all of this, I do believe that the Arctic Council has a very important role to play. The Russian Federation is coming in to chair the Arctic Council after Iceland turns over the baton early next year. And it's very important, in my view, that we support the Russian Federation in those efforts, that we maximize the potential of the Arctic. And if I could just end by building on Shawna's point on persisting organic pollutants, because I worked on the Stockholm Convention then as a delegate for Iceland. And the science from the Arctic was critical in allowing us to get an agreement on persistent organic pollutants at the time. For that reason, my belief is that we really need to use the science not as a canary in the coal mine, but as a serious wake-up call for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór, and thank you for highlighting the importance of carbon neutrality and actually the real challenge that we're facing. I think you said you're scared. I can share that also, and I think we're in a difficult situation. And so let's see. Let's get into the discussion now. Okay, so I would like to I wonder if any of the speakers would like to follow up on what the others have said, maybe just to sort of, while you're thinking about that, just to get the discussion going between yourselves. One question I'd like to put, and that's linked, starts with what Shawna said, that we mustn't forget about the people, and just simply focusing on the ice and the polar bears and that kind of thing is wrong, because there are people there. So that's one set of issues. But related to that is how the needs of the Arctic versus the needs of the whole globe, because you many of you have said that what happens in the Arctic will have a huge impact on the globe. So how do we address this issue? Any thoughts, any quick reactions from any of our speakers?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly jump in. You know, we have lots of parts of the planet that are vital organs for the entire planet. It's one complete system, and the Arctic is clearly at the top of the list of vital organs of the planet, and everybody needs an intact Arctic. Not just the people who live there, but the people who live in coastal communities around the world, people who live in India whose monsoons depend on Arctic ice. The list goes on, and I think that we are. I think that we are really undervaluing, under anticipating the risk of dangerous positive feedback loops that we see from a melting Arctic that are not modeled in most of the global climate models. Things like releases of methane, significant releases of methane, the changing albedo effect, which is only now beginning to be better modeled. And so we have less time than we think. And the sense of urgency is just not there. The Arctic science community is very robust. It's got incredible talent, and almost none of it is dedicated to the question of, can we keep the Arctic intact and stop it from unraveling?
Okay. I don't want to move away from the question that I've asked, which is about people versus nature and globe versus the Arctic. But you mentioned something, Brad, just now that also Pam referred to earlier. But are we too late?
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I mean, the science says we're not too late. The 1.5 degree report says we're not too late. I want to second what Shawna said, though, in terms of the, how can I put it, the offensiveness sometimes at the focus on, things like polar bears. It is a whole ecosystem. But I think what has offended me over the years, and I've been working, again, first as a diplomat with the Arctic Council and the permanent participants, as they're called, the Indigenous people organizations that are part of the Arctic Council, for the past 2.5, 3 decades, seeing the Indigenous people of the Arctic coming to these climate meetings and pleading for the community to pay attention. And I'm feeling more and more, and would like to ask Shawna how she feels about this, that it really is not a responsibility of the people living in the Arctic to have to say this. It really, the impacts are coming from the rest of the world, and it's the responsibility of the rest of the world to address it in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, rather than, it's almost like it's a burden that's always placed on the Indigenous people being there and needing to come to these climate meetings. We need to be looking at this and solving the problem below the Arctic, because that's where the issues are coming from.
Shawna, would you like to, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. I appreciate that question. And yes, I totally agree. I do think that the burden of, so many different parts of the process will be placed on Indigenous people, and has been placed on Indigenous people in terms of the climate and the environment. I really, I think it's always up to the Indigenous people to sacrifice, and it always has been, especially when you look at the United States and you understand, the doctrine of discovery, you understand papal bulls, you understand manifest destiny, and then think about how doctrine of discovery has been baked into Indigenous and Indian laws across the United States, and how that governs us as people. The thing I tend to like to point to is remembering about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, talking about free, prior, and informed consent, making sure that the communities have the knowledge so they can, have the decision-making power that they need to come to the decisions that are necessary for their own communities and their future generations, but also just to gently remind people to watch out for the savior mentality, because as Indigenous people, we have survived that for many years. And I think people tend to feel like it's our job to save everything and everybody. And, Christianity and other westernized religions with that savior mentality has only gotten us really so far.
Janos, could I
please
jump in on this? There are actually 2 thoughts I would want to put in here. One, in terms of Indigenous perspectives, I think they are hugely important for the global narrative. And here I'm not just talking about Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, but also the connections across the globe. And one of the things that has been quite interesting here with the Arctic Circle Assembly, which is an annual meeting of basically a conversation convened here in Iceland, has been the connection that they managed to achieve between Pacific Islands and the Indigenous people in the Arctic. But I also think we need to interrogate more the spiritual aspects of these questions. And I've just returned from a global conversation convened with kind of a geographical anchor here in Iceland. It was called Faith for Nature. And it's connected with efforts by the United Nations Environment Program to step up its action with faith communities to go from a Faith for Earth initiative to a Faith for Earth coalition. The reason I'm mentioning this is that the conversation that took place last week in the context of the Faith for we called it Faith for Nature, the conference. It was hubs in 5 regions of the world. was that there is, when you move away from theology to action, when you actually start looking at the things that people wish to achieve and take action, there is much more unity of purpose than we anticipate. So this goes back to this notion earlier that we basically need all tools in the toolkit. And the basic problem that we need to do is to change mindsets. We need to change ourselves. And that's a fundamental thing that we can't overlook. And governance is not just the domain of politicians or elected officials or their representatives. Governance is also about empowerment. It's about knowledge. It's about understanding and also ability to connect the dots. And so that's why your efforts, Janos, to kind of put focus on these questions early, I think it's very important. And so I think we have to take that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór. And it's important what you said in the sense that yes, we can't ignore, we can't throw away any of the potential solutions because we're in deep trouble. But we also have to think of very different ways and different approaches to the problem, and that includes faith and indeed many other such based approaches. And that's part of the totality of the solution.
Can you allow me one sentence here?
Yes, please,
it's very important that these solutions are aimed at the root causes of the problem, not just the symptoms.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we tend to do so often, is that we basically lock ourselves into a certain solution, and then you kind of you clean up afterwards. There has to be that has to change, and so we just can't continue to load up the atmosphere at the speed that we've been doing.
Can I just go back to either you, Halldór, but also the other colleagues here, is that absolutely the root cause is the primary goal of what we have to work on, but it's that there is this parallel process of having to clean up the mess that we have created, isn't it? How does that look like, and how does one deal with that in terms of social and political priorities?
Yeah, well, I fully agree with Brad, and maybe I should have continued with my narrative earlier on carbon neutrality, is that we don't stop at net zero. We need to go to negative. And but you can't get to negative without going through zero. That's the reality, and that's why I think I absolutely agree with you. I'm not by saying that advocating for an overshoot, but what I'm saying is that removals as one form of repair, I think is massive removals will need to continue. Because we're already at dangerous levels, and so we will have to be ready for that. I have an open mind if we can also intervene directly in terms of preserving some of the frozen stuff that we need. But I must say I'm still a bit skeptical just seeing the scale of the vastness of the ice fields. Thank you.
Can I comment?
Go ahead, Brad, and then Pam, if I may.
Okay, I was just going to say, my sense on this removal question is that we have a massive technology development challenge in front of us because we don't have the tools at the moment to remove carbon at the scale we need. That's not to say that we can't get there. And one of the things that we're doing is looking at ocean-based pathways for carbon dioxide removal. The ocean already is the major system that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and does it over geologic timeframes. And we're looking at biomimicry and geomimicry as approaches to accelerate, enhance, and scale ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. But we need a renaissance of talent and investment and energy into that field. And I just want to point out, we've spent the last 40 plus years trying to turn off the tap. And year on year on year, the tap has gone up. Now, I'm not saying that I like that. I can't stand that. But at some point, we have to be realistic that turning off the tap, we've lost. We are continuing to lose. And if we don't start to shift our thinking to also include cleaning it up while we continue to fight that fight, and we'll get there someday, but we don't, time is the most critical variable. We need to also start to embrace cleanup because it is also a viable way to arrest this problem. Keep working on turning off the tap, add massive investment of time and talent and energy to cleaning up the mess. It's not an either or, it's a yes and. We need both.
Thank you, Brad. Pam.
Yes, I wanted to address the idea that Brad also has referred to, that, either that it's too late or that we can't go there. It's almost exactly 2 years ago now that the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees came out. And this isn't rocket science. They laid out exactly how we can stay within 1.5 degrees. And Jim Skay, one of the Bureau members, said, we're the scientists. We have told you what you need to do. You need to decide whether or not you're going to do it. We can't make you do it. But certainly how to do it, we know. And it's hard, and we might not like that idea. But we have seen with the COVID-19 crisis what happens when we don't listen to the science. And it's not that people like wearing masks. It's not that people like social distancing or all of the other things we're under. But eventually it became very clear that we had to listen to the science and take all those steps in order to address the pandemic in the near term. We have an analogy then to what we're facing with climate change. We know what we need to do. We need to decide to do it. I do think that CDR can help us go down further. And as maybe we're not answering questions yet, but someone asked about what CO2 levels have been. And for about 3 million years during the period of ice ages that we've been in, it's gone between 180, 280, 180 to 280 in terms of glacials and interglacials. So 280 is actually where we were just 2 generations ago. Around 1850, 1870, our grandparents or great-grandparents, that's where we were. And so it's changed to this degree just in these few generations. And what I'm missing is that sense of urgency that we are indeed already in a danger zone. And we've been talking more and more, not so much about carbon neutrality by 2050, because that, to a certain degree, lets the politicians off the hook because it's so far out. What the 1.5 degree report says is 50% by 2030. That translates into 7% a year, every year during this decade. And that needs to be our goal. And we got there for 6 months with COVID-19. The question is, can we do it in a more measured and controlled way than what happened with COVID-19? Because, of course, now we've bounced back very close to where we were before the pandemic hit.
Can I just jump in there for 1 sec, Janos?
Yeah, please.
Because I want to just pick up on this point. The chance to get to 1.5, to have a 50% chance of getting to 1.5, according to that report, requires, first of all, transformations of systems like we've never seen, but also 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 removal by the end of the century. So that's in the 1.5 report. And that's a massive, that's just to get a 50% chance to get to 1.5. And that's a massive amount of CO2 removal. So we also have to put, this equal attention or more to that part of the equation, because the massive systemic changes that that are required to bring down the emissions are politically, they're a challenge that we have failed to meet so far.
Just one comment on that. There are multiple pathways, of course, that are outlined in the 1.5 degree report. And the high-end CDR are what you've cited. There are some of those pathways that see early mitigation that are more on the scale of 10 to 15. So it's still important. But again, mitigation, we know we can do. And I like the idea.
Do we know that we could do it though, Pam?
Yeah, we do. Technologically, yes. There's a wonderful,
but that's not the only question.
There's a wonderful meme that's often used from the 1.5 degree report that I wish I could share right now. Is it physically possible? Yes, that's what it said. Is it technologically possible? Yes. Is it economically possible? Yes. Is it socially possible? Yes. There are two unknowns in there, and it's political will and it's pressure from the general public. And those are the two things that are missing right now.
Exactly. And I think it would be important also, Janos, that we don't get stuck in this choice kind of paradigm. I don't think anyone is disagreeing that we need both. And in some cases, actually, we achieve both with the same action. And I also think it's important to realize that in the Arctic, but particularly outside the Arctic, there are huge benefits from building up carbon in the soil, for example, in terms of food security and in terms of resilience to the impacts of climate change. So there's, in my mind, no question that these removals are not just a cleanup. They also have very direct benefits, but they also take time, and that's why again we always come back to this because it's a cumulative problem. Any inaction this year is added to the action you need to achieve next year. And that's why I think it's so important that we kind of hammer home this. But at the same time, people are mainly motivated by kind of hope and excitement and benefits rather than by scaring. And that's why I think it's important we also develop this clear narrative in terms of what these solutions actually offer in terms of other benefits than climate.
Shawna, I saw you sent a signal that you'd like to speak, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to what Halldór said earlier about the spiritual aspect. And I would say as an Indigenous community here in Alaska, we do feel like this is a spiritual battle because spiritually it's our responsibility to take care of the environment and the animals, the land, the water, the air, and each other. And just curious how other people feel about the idea of just transition. And I'll just read the quick definition. Just transition means a fair and equitable shift to a regenerative economy, an economy that is in alignment with what the earth can regenerate and that ensured equity, dignity, and justice for all. But in addition to that, I also really wonder how many people, besides the folks in my organization and a lot of the other colleagues that we work with, are really talking about decolonization. And, that starts with understanding what colonialism really is, which is the policy or practice of acquiring political control over another country, land, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And then really talking about thinking around the ideas of decolonization. What does that really mean? So the restoration of cultural practices, thinking, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned through colonization, but are relevant and or necessary for survival and well-being. And so just trying to think about how we're putting these pieces together. And, I think the English language is actually quite primitive. I think there's not a way to express a lot of things in this language. And these are things that we can say in my traditional language. These are things that we can easily talk about and discuss. And so I just like to put some of those concepts, ideas, and sort of, thoughts forward for people to maybe comment on or think about.
Thank you, Shawna. And the last bit, what you said is so important. We've certainly in our work, we have had this many times that the language we use and that results in the framing of the issue, and the framing then is a narrative, and that has huge implications of what people do with it. And what you're saying now is that some of the language, after all, we use English mostly for this kind of work, some of the language cannot even describe some of the things that need to be described. So super important. Now, I would, there's Brad, just give me 1 second, Brad, and then I'll give you the floor. I'd like to remind the participants to put questions. They've already put a few questions up, and it seems that in the discussion we have pretty much answered them. So I'd like to ask them to, if there's still part of their questions have not been answered, that they should resubmit questions and also submit any other questions that you may have. Because we still have about half an hour, and that's good. But I think we've covered pretty much all the points that were raised in the question so far, in just naturally. But Brad, you wanted to react, so please go ahead.
Just to Shawna's point, I mean, I think absolutely the just transition is the transition that we have to make if we're going to reverse the damage that we've done to ourselves and our planet. And it stems from this economic inequality and the inequality of economic power throughout the globe. And it's the reason that I'm so pessimistic right now about our ability to beat that economic power and get the political will that we need to turn off the tap. Over time, these systems, if they continue, where essentially we just take, make, and throw away and leave the residues and all of the pain for the people that are there, leave all the impacts, whether it's rising sea levels or oppressive heat, we're going to lose, right? Over time, we have to get that trust transition. It has to happen at a global scale because we're really dealing with a global industry, a global industrial industry that has had this kind of footprint on our planet and our people. So I'm support what you say 100%.
But we need to remember that many of us are already losing. And so it's not just in terms of justice. I think it's really, justice is such an important foundation for unity. And just transition was used initially in terms of shifting the workforce, in terms of mitigation. But there's also just this dimension of inaction. And people that are suffering from inaction, that there is a justice dimension to that. But I think justice is a powerful motivator. And my sense is that we have to engage with these spiritual questions because it's actually lack of spirituality that's gotten us where we are now.
Okay. I would now like to, there's some more questions coming in, so I'd like to put a question to the group. Michael Brown asks, could the panelists please quantify the CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane emissions for the thawing permafrost and compare those numbers to 2100 to carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degree carbon?
Yeah, I was actually just looking that up. I saw that question. So at 1.5 degrees through 2100, but I'm going to quantify that a little bit further, through 2100, it's about 30% of the carbon budget would come from permafrost. And so that really needs to be taken into account. And the IPCC has done that and will in AR6, the next assessment report. So it's about on the scale of 130 gigatons. At 2 degrees, it goes up to maybe 200 gigatons by 2100. It's not as high a proportion, but it, of course, goes up as temperatures rise. But one important aspect of permafrost that I didn't really comprehend until about a year ago is that once permafrost thaws, it continues emitting carbon for somewhere between 200 or 300 years. So as we allow temperatures to rise, we're not just getting the release of carbon, CO2, and methane, depending on how it thaws. By 2100, we're committing ourselves to negative emissions and the need for negative emissions for 200 to 300 years after that. So speaking to Shawna's talking about justice, there's also the aspect of intergenerational justice, where the more we have our own inaction, the more we're committing future generations to have to continue cleaning up this mess. because permafrost is the gift that keeps on giving, unfortunately, for a couple of centuries after it first thaws, even if we bring temperatures down again, which is, again, an overshoot aspect.
Thank you, Pam. I have one more question here coming from the participants. An anonymous participant asks, can Brad speak more about his bio-inspiration work? Share a few good examples that are ocean-based. Brad.
So I'm assuming that is referring to the comment I made about biomimicry and geomimicry for these ocean-based carbon dioxide removal pathways. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a series. They're either biotic, meaning they use the power of photosynthesis to capture carbon from the ocean, from the atmosphere and water, and store it. And those are macroalgae and microalgae. And there's a lot of work going on around cultivating at large scales, both micro and macroalgae, and then either extracting the carbon or compressing the residue and burying it at the bottom of the sea, which is an acceleration of a process that does happen naturally. On the more abiotic side, ocean alkalinity enhancement. So essentially interacting alkaline material with seawater to extract CO2 out of seawater to allow the ocean to absorb more CO2 out of the atmosphere is one of the pathways. There's a lot of work being done on this. And finally, electrochemical approaches to directly removing CO2 out of seawater. The National Academy of Sciences has just launched a one-year study of these ocean-based pathways. And so any of you who are interested in them, please take a look at the National Academy. And Ocean Visions has a mapping exercise, a technology development mapping exercise around these pathways. These are all at the very nascent moments of development, but we know the scale and size of the ocean in terms of what it currently stores in carbon relative to the atmosphere. It's something like 50 times greater amount of carbon in the deep ocean than in the atmosphere. So we know that there's a possibility of actually being able to get there with ocean-based solutions.
Thank you, Brandon. I'd like to actually continue this a little bit further with all the four guests that we have around the table, that if we look at the different geographic, political constraints that are there in the Arctic, and we look at the local versus global issues that we have discussed, and there are many of those, including, let's not forget small island countries that are being submerged because of climate change. They may also have a view on what we're talking about, even though they're not part of the Arctic. So the question that I have is that given these various constraints, what do you see as some of the potentially favorable options for carbon removal, both in terms of the reducing the current emissions, the offsetting, and also potential removing carbon in the long term? Any sort of quick thoughts from any of our speakers? A kind of a list of some of the interesting options that may be relevant.
Well, I just gave three.
That's why I said I'd like to continue. But
so I'll let others talk.
Yeah, maybe I could just elaborate a little bit, Janos, with your permission, on what I referred to earlier with the experiments that's being made here with active basalt in Iceland. Just to underline that it's not limited to the geology of Iceland. So that potential goes way beyond the confines of that unique island. But like all of these things, none of them are silver bullets. And there are no silver bullets in this. But we just need to push forward on these things. And I'm excited about what Brad is talking about. And we really, if I could suggest kind of from a governance perspective, we just have to kind of give the criteria to the scientific community and really invest in their their abilities to move forward. And the criteria really relates, in my mind, to both issues around scalability, issues around potential adverse effects, but also issues we have to face that as well. We need to look at the issue of cost and economy, and the possibility of creating business models around this. And so my sense is that from a governance perspective, we really need kind of a Manhattan Project type of thinking here. And that's what I was referring to also here, is that we can't just be focusing on the potential risks with a solution. We also have to weigh those potential risks of those solutions against the potential risks, or the known risks, actually, not potential, the known risks of inaction or further delay. And so my sense is that I'm not an expert on any of the other technological solutions, so that's the only one that I can refer to, and maybe I could mention that it was originally deployed in the context of renewable energy, in terms of geothermal energy, capturing CO2 that is released when energy is released from geothermal fields. And the solutions that are now being looked at is actually capturing greenhouse gases from landfills, and also emissions from aluminium production. And so there are some significant sources that are being looked at for that particular technology, but we just need so many of them.
Thank you, Halldór.
Can I mention one that we've been working on? Or sorry, were you giving the word to someone else?
No. I was going to ask you because I saw your hand.
Yes. I mean, this is something, unfortunately, I can't quantify, but we began working on burning in agroforestry many years ago, mostly because of the impact of black carbon on the Arctic. But there's an even more important connection, which is that if fire isn't used in agricultural or forestry practices, not only do you not get the emissions from the actual fires and the wildfires that spread from them. So these extreme wildfires that occurred in Siberia and far eastern Russia this past hot summer, most of them actually spread from human activity, from people who were burning fields on the edges of these Siberian forests. And if you think about it, soil has carbon. When that soil burns, not only does the biomass burn, but the carbon that is in the soil burns. It becomes very brittle. It erodes. You go down another layer into the soil. And so when you have these fires that are set by humans year after year after year, you're losing a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. If you use fire-free methods, which do fix carbon in the soils, and someone had asked about biochar, this is even absent biochar. This is simply using conservation agriculture, putting the prior crop, keeping it on the soil. We certainly know that we can start drawing down carbon, and this is known as regenerative agriculture. And it's interesting because if you go back into, again, indigenous knowledge, we know that at least in South America, which is one of the places where we're working in the Andes, bringing these methods not to burn, if you go back about 400 years, it was actually something occasionally even punishable by death if you used fire, because that was seen as an affront against Mother Earth to burn her. And so it's as though we're coming back then with these science-based methods of fixing carbon in the soil to where indigenous peoples in the Andes already were prior to colonization. So there's a lot we can do even without high tech to go back to pulling carbon down from the atmosphere.
Shawna, can I ask you to also address this from your perspective, from the indigenous communities in the region? What would be the approaches that seem more or less favorable in your perspective?
I would say, and thank you for that. I would say that we do have a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that helps us understand our relationship to the environment and our responsibilities and what that means. And for example, in my community, when we were brought to this place, we were given by our creator original instructions. And one of our original instructions was to always keep the forest floors clean. And so as we were nomadic people and we moved around, we would always burn all the fallen brush and all the fallen trees just to make sure that the forest floor stayed clean. And that helped us with different bug infestations, but also with forest fires. And so it was part of our responsibility to do that job. A mentor of mine, Andrea Carmen, one of the many architects for the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, says a few different things about this. I appreciated what Pam said earlier when she talked about how during COVID, we saw the fluctuation in terms of, what was being released into the atmosphere. One of the things my mentor would say is, you don't know how bad you want something until you know what you're willing to give up to get it. And I think that is a very different concept than coming up with a magic pill or a silver bullet or yet another Band-Aid to put on the symptoms. She also said, don't do other people's organizing for them. And she also said, don't take responsibility where you have no authority. And I follow those three things, that little pieces of information that she's given me with all her years of work at the UN, and realize those are the kinds of things that will help everybody be able to come to some positive solutions. Because in the long run, these quote unquote resources of oil and gas, fossil fuels, they're running out, and they are going to run out. And the reason I'm talking about just transition isn't necessarily because I'm talking about justice for communities or for governments or for the economy. The reason I'm talking about just transition is because we know transition is inevitable, but what we don't have a guarantee on is if the communities will have justice. And so really thinking about the way we frame it is the people that are closest to the problem are oftentimes closest to the solution, because they're the people living in the community, understanding the changes, understanding what their needs are and what they need to do in order to assist with those issues. And so just always making sure that Indigenous people are in the forefront, as we typically are, asking, we typically attend all the climate talks, we're protesting, we're meeting with the governments, we're begging for our lives, we're talking about genocide, we're trying to do these things. I think it's just important to remember that we're not really going to know as a society, as a global community, how important something like this is until we really know what we're willing to give up to get it.
Thank you, Shawna. Very, very important points here. And the transition will happen. How to make sure that it happens in a just way. And you've given a few examples to that, few ideas there. Maybe I'd like to sort of shift the conversation a little bit to the governance institutions that we have that can help or not to make this happen. And if I see the four of you in front of me, each of you have very different set of experiences in this area. And I would like each of you to sort of say a few words about how you see the existing intergovernmental and non-governmental or non-state actor institutions that are currently there, that are able to help in moving the Arctic forward, not just for the transition, which has to happen, but for a just transition. And Shawna, you have a very different perspective from the indigenous people. Halldór and Pam, you've had experience in intergovernmental processes and so on, including some of the current things that are happening. And Brad, you've had that experience in substantial civil society, well, actually various civil society organizations. So I would appreciate if you could each say a few words about how you see the institutions, whether state governmental or non-state actors, and how what are some of the challenges moving forward?
All right. Well, I'll jump in. I'll jump in and stir things up. I mean, I think what we're experiencing today is a failure of governmental institutions, from intergovernmental to national governments to regional governments. You know, we're facing a threat against humanity and all of life on the planet. And if that's not a symptom of failed governance, I don't know what is. So I don't have any brilliant ideas for what the right governance structure is. I do know that for things to scale quickly, it rarely happens through government. And we need things to scale quickly. And, you know, I think that will happen, or governments will take individual action. There's nothing stopping an individual government from engaging in large scale ocean CDR, for example, or solar radiation management. You know, so it's tough. Janos, you're at the crux of this, but thinking that we're going to get through a long process where we make decisions collectively as 192 nations, or however many it is, it just seems incredibly daunting.
Can I just push you before you go, Halldór? Just maybe one more step, Brad, in your own thinking. If whatever the institutions are, governmental or non-governmental, non-state, but what can you envisage as next steps in the area that we've been talking about, which is the Arctic climate crisis and carbon dioxide removal?
Well, I mean, I think to Halldór's point earlier, you know, there's got to be an economic motivation here. Unfortunately, we operate and we coordinate activities seamlessly around the globe on economic signals of people who don't even understand each other or don't even know each other, understand each other's language. So we've got to figure out an economic model for carbon removal, ultimately, that gets the job done while most of the world doesn't even pay attention to it, because most of the world is not paying attention to this crisis. Let's be honest. They're just not. And, you know, lining up what are going to be valuable products, whether in agriculture, whether in co-products from extracted CO2, or just the enlightened private sector paying for negative carbon, that's what's going to get this moving, in my view.
Okay,
maybe, yeah, what I would want to, I mean, first, the good news is that on climate, there are really not that much left to be negotiated among 200 countries. And this is a very, it's good news, because it is, as Brad was outlining, it's a challenge, especially now with the current geopolitical situation. The good news is we do have the framework. And so the action is actually moving now much more down to the national and the local level, and also to innovation, science and technology, but also to awareness raising and education and connecting people across the globe, like we were talking about earlier around the indigenous peoples. And so, yes, the governance arrangements under the Paris Agreement will continue to be there, but that's not where the biggest action lays now. The action really now is implementation. And making things happen, and it needs to happen fast enough. But it's very much also about economic reform. And that's why, in terms of governance, my sense is that the attention now needs to move away from governance of climate regimes to governance of economic regimes, and internalizing our environmental costs and putting a price on carbon. We just have to face that reality. You will not have the penetration of technology solutions if if we continue with the market failure that we have now, where you can actually store carbon in the atmosphere at no cost to you, but the cost to everyone else. And that's why my sense is that that's hugely important. We also have to realize that there is more money now put into discrediting science that there is money put into informing people about science. There's a battle from between vested interests that own the current energy system. And by the way, in some countries, they also own the political system. I won't name the countries. And so we just have to realize that we are on a collision course with fundamental basic principles of physics. And we can't negotiate with physics. And so that's why my sense, we basically have these two choices. We transform through a crash, or we transform through a deliberate decision to transform. And that's where I think the battle is now. And we still, like we discussed earlier, and where Pam has outlined that in terms of the assessment from the IPCC, we still have that window. The question is, will we use it? Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór. Pam, Shawna, any reactions on this in this area?
Sure. I guess I would just say, from my perspective, watching the native corporations here in Alaska, a lot of people don't understand globally what it sort of looks like, but we don't have reservations. We have one reservation in Alaska, and we have 229 federally recognized tribes, which is nearly 40% of the nation's tribes here in Alaska. And now we're finding environmental organizations pairing with big oil companies to contact our native corporations who often sell us out in terms of our values, our traditional values, and they are participating in the carbon capture credits and sequestration situation, which, in my opinion, I feel is somewhat like a Ponzi scheme. We are, selling these credits, but still very impacted because we're in the Arctic. It doesn't matter where you're releasing the carbon from and how many credits you get, we're still having these impacts. And also thinking about these kinds of technologies that are not tested and that are, putting us as Indigenous people in the forefront of understanding what it means. We, in a sense, are the canary in the coal mine as Indigenous people. And so I would just say, I really do wish you all the best, everybody working on these issues, because as Indigenous people, we've been here. And we know how we have a relationship with the land. And quite honestly, we know how to survive on the land, whether the rest of the world figures out economic reform or not. We know how to live with the land. We've been here and we're gonna be here. So for the rest of you, I personally will never suffer from food insecurities, because when the tide goes out, my table is set. I can go out into the wilderness, I can get moose, we can hunt, we fish here, we gather, we have a direct connection with the environment. And so I hope the rest of the world can figure out these ideas for economic reform. And whether we're put, in the coal mine as the canaries or not, we're gonna be here. So my concern typically is for the rest of everybody else.
Thank you, Sean. And we're actually getting close to the end of this session. So I have one more technical question, which is a kind of a...
And can I also answer your question, though?
Oh, I'm so sorry, Pam. Yes, please go ahead. And then I'll conclude. Okay, please.
Because, Shawna, I think I'd almost like to quote you on that at some point, if I may. Indigenous people in the Arctic are not the canary, because the canary doesn't survive. And you're absolutely right. You will. I'm going to take a position that I normally don't take because in many ways I'm very pessimistic, and yet I want to push back on two things. I do think that the world is paying attention in a way it has not before. It's being forced to pay attention. And the second is that the governments actually are going to have to set the table. Governments can move quickly, and without the kind of economic rules that Halldór referred to, business probably will not respond, because business indeed is not in the business of saving the planet. And I think that there is movement. There are governments, particularly in the Nordic region, that have set even more ambitious goals than 50% by 2030. They're moving the ball where the rest of us can go. And these are not small economies. If you take all 5 Nordic countries together, they're either 10th, 11th, or 12th in the world. So I think there are those who are leading the way about how we can stay within 1.5 degrees. If they can be joined by more and more countries, and our big push is Glasgow next year, then maybe we can finally see the kind of urgent movement and not just sort of pie in the sky putting things forward to 2050 that we need. And I would love to start discussing, as some of our participants have in their questions, using CDR not to stay below 400, but to get us back to 280 again. That would be a wonderful goal.
Thank you, Pam. And as I said earlier, there's one technical question. I would appreciate if one or more of you could very briefly answer that, and then we have to wrap up. A technical question. Paul, a participant, asked about the panel's thoughts on biochar. We had mentioned biochar already, but he says it's much better than BECCS and can be implemented now. Does anyone on the panel have thoughts about the appropriateness of BECCS for the Arctic? Just very quickly. In the Arctic region.
You mean biochar for the Arctic, I assume?
Biochar,
right? Yeah. I know enough about biochar to know that I don't know enough about it. People fall on both sides in terms of its potential, and studies point both ways. So it certainly is something that should be explored.
Yes, and I referred earlier to the importance of building up soil carbon, and this is one of the approaches to doing that. So, and therefore, I've been quite interested in that potential. I can't quantify the potential, but I really think that this is part of the solution that needs to be pursued.
Thank you. Colleagues, if any of you have a 30-second important message that you have wanted to say during the discussion, but you haven't had a chance, this is a good moment, but very short if you have.
I just want to also second that I think there is movement, and I was quite encouraged by the Countdown TED event over the weekend. And if you didn't look at that, I think you should. And also in the context of Glasgow, which is actually now equally important to what the Paris conference was 5 years ago. That's a hugely important, but it's not about negotiations. It's about mobilization. It's about actually releasing the enormous potential.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Halldór. Brad?
The only thing I would add, Janos, is that beyond CDR, we need to also go to ecosystem support, because nothing on the horizon right now looks to arrive in time to be secure about not losing critical parts of the system that we need for our children and grandchildren to survive. And that's the next phase of discussions.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Other thoughts?
I would just add very quickly that my mentor that did a lot of that work had traveled to a lot of different indigenous communities all over the world working on UNDRIP. And she would always ask communities if there was a way to say in their language the word rights, in terms of, we have these inalienable rights. We have the right to, drive our cars. We have the right to, do these things. And in all of those communities, she was never able to find any Indigenous language that had a way to say that. The only way to say it is the term responsibility. And so I think just ending on the note that we all have to remember, it really isn't about our rights, but truly about our responsibility.
Thank you. Okay. Then thank you very much for this really exciting discussion. I wanted at the very end just to say thank you to my colleague Cynthia Scharf, who would have been involved in preparing this, but who has been away from the office because of an accident, but she's getting better and we hope to see her back maybe next month. So with that, thank you. It was a really amazing discussion and we look forward to the positive things that will have to happen. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.